Humans have been fascinated by the possibility of time travel for many generations now. It's frequently the subject of science fiction. As various fiction writers and philosophers and scientists have thought about the possibility of time travel and whether it could ever actually happen in real life, there are some paradoxes that have come up. So there are a number of these, but we're going to talk specifically about what's known as the grandfather paradox, which is a good example of the kind of paradox that you run into with time travel. So the way that the grandfather paradox would proceed is, suppose that someone built a time machine and used it to go back in time and kill his own grandfather. Well, if the time traveler kills his grandfather, then he, meaning the time traveler, never comes into being. So if the traveler kills his grandfather, then he never exists to build the time machine. But if the traveler never exists to build the time machine, then his grandfather is not assassinated, and time proceeds as it normally would, which means that the traveler does exist, and he does build the time machine, and he does go back in time to kill his grandfather. So then the question is, does the time traveler exist and go back in time to kill his grandfather or not? It seems as though we're committed to saying that the time traveler kills his grandfather if and only if he does not kill his grandfather, and he does not kill his grandfather if and only if he does kill his grandfather. Well, of course, this is self-contradictory. If it's true that one claim is necessary and sufficient for the other, and that seems to be what we're saying here, then both of them would have to be true at the same time. But here, they're contradictory. Claim A cannot be necessary and sufficient for B if the two claims contradict each other, or, of course, vice versa. It would be like saying that it is raining if and only if it is not raining. Of course, that makes no sense. That's not a position that could even possibly be true. I guess another way of seeing why it's paradoxical and your position would seemingly not make any sense if you were to make this claim that the time traveler goes back in time to kill his grandfather, is just to ask yourself, does the time traveler exist or not? It seems as though you're saying both that the time traveler does exist and that the time traveler does not exist. And of course, they can't both be true at once. Okay, so what would the solution be? Well, some say that actually there is no solution and that this shows that time travel is impossible. I wonder if that's really the case. Now, I would say, though, that I am skeptical of the idea of time travel. I don't really think that it's very likely that time travel will be possible because I believe in the Aristotelian sense of time. I think Aristotle gave probably the best description of it of anybody, and Aristotle just thought of time as motion. And by motion, we're speaking broadly, so even like aging. Basically, he means by motion any kind of change. And really, if you think about it, when people talk about time, that's kind of what they mean. When you say that something is frozen in time, what that means is no change is taking place. And even the way we measure time, like the motion of the Earth, that's a year, is one revolution around the sun. The way that we mark off a month is one lunar cycle, right? So that's how we mark time, is change. And so if that's true, then I don't know if you can necessarily go backwards in change. People want to treat time as a spatial dimension, but a spatial dimension you can, of course, move in any direction. Time doesn't really seem to be like that, though. It seems as though time only moves from past to present to future, and I'm not really sure that you can reverse that or go back in time. Maybe it's kind of like what Heraclitus said, which is that you can never step foot in the same river twice. Maybe it would always be a little bit different so that you could never actually move back to the way things were exactly at some point in time. Still, though, I don't know that we should necessarily think that time travel is impossible just because of this paradox. And so I have possibly an alternative way of looking at it for how this might happen if, in fact, there were time travel. So even though I'm skeptical of it, I think there's a low probability. I don't necessarily think that it's impossible. So let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, what would happen if time travel were possible how could this paradox be resolved? Well, my thought is perhaps the time traveler killing his grandfather would not cut the timeline. It would just create a time loop. And actually, even just the fact that he traveled back in time would probably create this time loop. So in order to explain what I mean, it's actually a kind of difficult idea to express, but I'll do my best. I want to use a piece of string as an analogy. So this piece of string can be thought of as time or a timeline. Okay, so I feel like the way that the grandfather paradox is being interpreted, it would be like cutting the piece of string. So the time traveler killing his grandfather would be equivalent to cutting the string. And the reason why that would be the case is that it would seem as though by killing his own grandfather, he would also cut off his own existence. And it seems paradoxical because you don't know whether the string has been cut or not. It seems like it has to be one way or the other, but it's hard to tell how it could be one or the other. It seems as though both are being asserted at the same time. What I wonder, though, is if maybe traveling back in time with the time machine would be more like a loop. So it would create this loop in time. And so you do have this point where the future connects with the past, and it's this loop around. But what that would mean, or at least we ought to consider the possibility that what that would do is that would create, in a sense, like an alternate future. So what would happen is that along this path, things would proceed exactly as we know them to be, and then it would only be at this point at which the time traveler's past and future would be altered. So it wouldn't be the case that the time traveler never exists. The time traveler would still exist within this part of the loop. He would still grow up and create the time machine and then use the time machine to travel back in time and so forth. But then once that happens, once his grandfather is assassinated, then that's going to affect this part of the line. And so it would affect the time traveler's future and simultaneously his past. So the time traveler might disappear from existence at that point, but it would not be the case that he wouldn't exist within the loop. So the thing that we have to keep in mind here is that if we think of this as a causal sequence of events, the time traveler killing his grandfather is much later. If we think of time progressing upwards here in this case, so the past is low and the future is moving up, then in terms of a causal sequence, when you actually do this is much, much later in terms of the chain of causes than what was the time that your grandfather knows, for example, okay? So what would happen then as a result of this is that basically time would just restart from that point on an alternate path. And so you would, in a way, have two futures, in a sense, where you'd have the one that we know, and then you would have another one that would progress based upon you going back in time and killing your grandfather. So if this is the case, then it wouldn't be that we would be saying that the time traveler both exists and does not exist at the same time. He would exist within the loop. He wouldn't exist after this point. Now, one thing that I want to clarify here is that there is what they call the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, in which basically every quantum event is going to create a new reality, a new parallel world. I'm not necessarily saying that. As you can see, it's still actually the same line. So we haven't necessarily branched off here. It's just going to be a later part of the line. So we just have to think about this. It's kind of strange to think about you going back in time and making contact with your grandfather as a future event rather than a past event, but that's really what it would be. So all of that has to happen after the time machine is built, which just means that it happens later in the line. So even though the line is curled around on itself, it's still a future event rather than a past event. Okay, so it would be the case that both the future and the past are affected for the time traveler, but it would only be affecting this part of the line. It would always move this way, and it wouldn't jump from one string to the other. It would just continue to progress in this direction, loop around, and then continue to progress in this direction, just as if it were straight and it were progressing in this way. Okay, so just to see another example of how this might work, Stephen Hawking, one time, decided to throw a party for time travelers. He actually had this really lavish party, even with champagne and so on, and he called it a welcome reception for future time travelers. And he didn't send out any invitations for it until it had already taken place. The invitation read, "You are cordially invited to a reception for time travelers hosted by Professor Stephen Hawking, to be held in the past at the University of Cambridge, Gonville, and Caius College, Trinity Street, Cambridge." And of course, he included exact coordinates in time and space so that they'd be able to find it. So this gathering took place on the 28th of June, 2009. And it had the important disclaimer that no RSVP was required to attend. So Hawking waited for his guests to arrive, but unfortunately nobody came. And so he said, "What a shame. I was hoping a future Miss Universe was going to step through the door." So this is pretty clever. But I don't know if it necessarily disproves time travel, and maybe he didn't necessarily intended to do that, because he said maybe at some future point time travelers will do this. But the way that maybe we ought to think about this is that, okay, so suppose that that time travel is possible in 10,000 AD, and that these people decide they want to come back and in time and meet Stephen Hawking at his party. Okay, well, what would happen? Well, the way that I would look at it is that you would then have this time loop where they would come back around to the point of 2009, right? Okay? Well, just imagine what would happen if that had been the case. How different would the future have been from 2009, from that party? So I'm sure if Stephen Hawking would have come out and told everybody that he'd met time travelers and introduced them to the world and so on, people would probably be pretty skeptical at first. Even though it's Stephen Hawking, even though he's a very well-respected physicist, they probably still wonder if maybe he'd gone a little crazy. But maybe they could convince him and could convince everybody else through their advanced technology that, you know, eventually we might believe that they really are time travelers. Well, think about how that's going to change the future. It's going to be essentially an entirely different future at that point than the one that we know. So this video was made in 2019, so it's been about 10 years since this party. So imagine how different the past 10 years would have been if there had been time travelers. Think about all the advanced technology that we would have. Think about how radically different the future would have been. So, you know, if we think about this from like a chaos theory standpoint, anytime you introduce this new variable, it's going to have a large impact on the overall system. And so I wonder if what would happen is that it just essentially creates a different future from that point. So you would have our future, the one that we know, that would proceed along this path. Okay, so here would be 2010 and 2011 and 2012 and so on, and everything would be exactly as we perceive it to be along this part of the line. But since this is a future event, it would actually take place after, in a way it would take place after 10,000 AD. So, you know, if we stretch the string out, them building the time machine and coming back to Stephen Hawking's party would actually be here. It wouldn't be down here as we tend to think of it. So if that's the case, then it would essentially just restart time from that point, and it would progress in a different way from 2009 onwards. Now, the reason why this would be risky for the time travelers, though, is that they wouldn't know what kind of impact that's going to have. So they're affecting not just their own future, but also simultaneously their past. And so because of that, they might choose not to do it, even if they had the technical capability to do it, because it would just likely be very risky. The future would have to be pretty horrible in order for people in the future to choose a complete unknown over what they do know, because generally we're a little bit more biased towards having a fear of the unknown rather than sort of the bad things that we do know. So it's probably unlikely that they would actually do it, even if they had the capability of it. But if they did, just for the sake of argument, then maybe all this shows is that we're in this part of the loop and not in this part. Maybe that's all Stephen Hawking was able to prove, is that we are still in this area right here of the line and not in the later part of the line. And maybe at some future point, that would be the case. And then it would almost sort of restart time from 2009 on to create a different future. So I think it's just kind of an interesting thing to think about, and maybe a way that the paradox could be made tenable, at least, even if you don't think it's likely.